and the forging and working of metal. I mean, we who take this for granted have no idea how mysterious and powerful this seemed to ancient people. And in fact, it would seem so to us if we had anything to do with it. I mean, how many of us are welders or casters of metal? It's a magical process to take, for instance, cinnabar, a red soft ore, and by the mere act of heating it in a furnace, it will sweat liquid mercury onto its surface. Well, we have unconsciously imbibed the ontology of science, where we have mind firmly separated out from the world. We take this for granted. It's effortless because it's the ambiance of the civilization that we've been born into. But in an earlier age, and some writers would say a more naive age, but I wonder about that. But in an earlier age, mind and matter were seen to be alloyed together throughout nature, so that the sweating of mercury out of cinnabar is not a material process. It's a process in which the mind and the observations of the metal worker maintain an important role. And let's talk for a moment about Mercury, because the spirit Mercurius is almost the patron deity of alchemy. You all know what mercury looks like. It's at room temperature, a silvery liquid that flows. It's like a mirror. For the alchemists, and this is just a very short exercise in alchemical thinking, for the alchemists, mercury was mind itself, in a sense, and by tracing through the steps by which they reached that conclusion, you can have a taste of what alchemical thinking was about. Mercury takes the form of its container. If I pour mercury into a cup, it takes the shape of the cup. If I pour it into a test tube, it takes the shape of a test tube. This taking the shape of its container is a quality of mind, and yet here it is present in a flowing silvery metal. The other thing is, mercury is a reflecting surface. You never see mercury. What you see is the world that surrounds it, which is perfectly reflected in its surface like a moving mirror, you see. And then if you've ever, as a child, I mean, I have no idea how toxic this process is, but I spent a lot of time as a child hounding my grandfather for his hearing aid batteries, which I would then smash with a hammer and get the mercury out and collect it in little bottles and carry it around with me. Well, the wonderful thing about mercury is when you pour it out on a surface and it beads up, then each bead of mercury becomes a little microcosm of the world, and yet the mercury flows back together into a unity. Well, as a child, you see, I had not yet imbibed the assumptions and the ontology of science. I was functioning as an alchemist. For me, mercury was this fascinating magical substance onto which I could project the contents of my mind. And a child playing with mercury is an alchemist, hard at work, no doubt about it. Well, so then this is a phenomenon in the physical world, and then mind is a phenomenon as in the Cartesian distinction, which is between the res extensa and the res virens. This is the great splitting of the world into two two parts. I remember Al Huang once said to me, we were talking about the yin-yang symbol, and he said, you know, the interesting thing is not the yin or the yang. The interesting thing is the S-shaped surface which runs between them. And that S-shaped surface is a river of alchemical mercury. Now, where the alchemists saw this river of alchemical mercury is in the boundary between waking and sleeping. There is a place, not quite sleeping, not quite waking, and there flows this river of alchemical mercury, where you can project the contents of the unconscious and you can read it back to yourself. This kind of thinking is confounding to scientific thought, where the effort is always to fix everything into a given identity and a given set of behaviors. Now, the other hermetic perception that is well illustrated by just thinking for a moment about Mercury is the notion, and this is central to all hermetic thinking, of the microcosm and the macrocosm. That somehow the great world, the whole of the cosmos, is reflected in the mystery of man, meaning men and women. It's reflected in the mystery of the human mind-body interface. So for an alchemist, it makes perfect sense to extrapolate from these internal, what we call internal psychological processes, to external processes in the world. That distinction doesn't exist for the alchemist, and I tell you, the longer I live, the more convinced I am that this is just absolutely the truth. The myth of our society is the existential myth, that we are cast into matter, that we are lost in a universe that has no meaning for us, that we must make our meaning. This is what Sartre and Kierkegaard, all those people are saying, that we must make our meaning. It reaches its most absurd expression in Sartre's statement that nature is mute. I mean, this is as far from alchemical thinking as you can possibly get, because for the alchemist, nature was a great book, an open book to be read by putting nature through processes which revealed not only its inner mechanics, but the inner mechanics of the artifacts, the person working upon the material. In other words, the alchemist. Well, in other contexts, I've talked about the importance of language and how our world is made of language. And part of the problem with understanding alchemy is that the language is slipping out of our reach. We are so completely imbued with the Cartesian categories of the res virens, the world of thought, and the res extensa, the world of three-dimensional space, and causality, and the conservation of matter and energy, and so forth, that in order to do more than carry out a kind of scholarship of alchemy, we have to create an alchemical language, or a field in which alchemical language can take place. Some of you may have been with me a couple of weeks ago in Malibu when Joan Halifax and I debated the roots of Buddhism. And I think Joan deserves great credit for saying that Buddhism would never have taken root in America were it not for the psychedelic phenomenon. Not that Buddhism is psychedelic, it in fact is fairly touchy about that. But Buddhism would have gotten nowhere in America had not psychedelics created created a context for Buddhist language to take root. And I would wager that I would never have gotten to first base with proposing a weekend on alchemy at Esalen were it not understood that psychedelics have prepared people for the notion that mind and world can be poured together like mercury and sulfur, like the sulfic waters, to create a new kind of understanding. Because otherwise, modernity has fixed our minds in the categories of Cartesian rationalism. And so I will not claim, and do not in fact think it's so, that there was anything overtly psychedelic in the sense of pharmacologically based about alchemy. When we look back through the alchemical literature, there's very little evidence that it was pharmacologically driven. Only when you get to the very last adumbrations of the alchemical impulse in someone like Paracelsus do you get the use of opium. But it is interesting that the great drugs of modern society were accidentally discovered by alchemists in their researches. Distilled alcohol is a product of alchemical work. And then, as I mentioned, opium was very heavily used by the Paracelsian school. But what they possessed was an ability to liquefy their mental categories and then to project the contents of the mind onto these processes and read them back. Now, this is what made alchemy so fascinating to the Jungian school, because the Jungians were discovering the unconscious, and they realized before Jung's involvement with alchemy, the best material for psychotherapy to work upon was dreams, but dream and mythology, and these were the two poles of the data field that the discovery of the unconscious was working on. Well, then Jung had the prescience to realize that alchemy, which to that point, as the gentleman over here said, had been dismissed as a naive effort to turn base metals into gold, this is the first fiction that you have to absolutely purge from your mind. The only alchemists that ever tried to turn base metals into gold were charlatans, the so-called puffers, because they were called that not only for their exaggerated speech, but for their use of bellows to drive their fires. And alchemy has always had a core of true adepts, and then a surround of misguided souls and outright con artists who were trying to change base metals into gold. Now, it's interesting that science, in its naivete in the 20th century, has actually completed the program of pseudo-alchemy. You can, if you have a sufficiently powerful nuclear reactor, change lead into gold. I mean, the cost is staggering. It has no economic importance whatsoever, but it can be done by bombarding gold with a sufficient amount of heavy particles on lead. You can change it into gold. But this is not what the original intent was. In fact, when we look at the history of 20th century science, we will see that in a way it's a misunderstanding of what the alchemical goals were to be, and one by one it has done these things that were stated goals of the alchemists, except that the alchemists always spoke in similes and in a secret control language that was symbolic. Okay, now another point that was brought up was, in going around the circle, was the externalization of the soul. And what we're trying to do is, in this weekend, is study and talk about the idea of redeeming the world through magic. And how is this to be done? Well, the Philosopher's Stone is a complex of ideas that no matter how you divide it, no matter how you slice it, it's very difficult to hold the pith essence of this concept. But what it really comes down to is the idea that spirit is somehow resident in matter in a very diffuse form, and that the goal of Hermetic thinking and later alchemy is the concentration and redemption of this spirit, a focusing of it, a bringing of it together. This is an idea that was common in the Hellenistic world, not only to Hermetic thinking, but also to Gnosticism. Gnosticism is the idea that somehow the pure, holy, real light of being was scattered through a universe of darkness and of